Hi everyone, welcome. Today we're going to be conducting this webinar and addressing transforming pathway performance, leveraging key knowledge of pathways, principles, populations, and practices. We really appreciate you taking the time to participate with us today. And today our presenters are going to be briefly introducing a draft facilitation tool and providing a quick overview in the about 30 minutes that we have together. There will be a time for questions and answers at the end, so if you have questions during the presentation, please submit them at any time during the webinar. Just use the question tool and we'll be sure to address them at the end. Before we get started, I just want to share a few logistical details with you. First, that this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a link to today's webinar recording, the slides from the presentation, as well as a draft of the new tool that's being presented. And additionally, we're going to be sending out a short 5-question survey to get feedback on the tool that's presented today. So you should expect to see these materials in your inbox in the next 2 weeks. If you happen to have any technical difficulties, please feel free to email us at the email that is on the screen. If you can, feel free to write your questions in the question box if any issues are coming up, and I'll be sure to address them. And just remember to please keep your microphone muted during the webinar to minimize background noise. And with that, I think we're ready to get started, so I'll turn the presentation over to our presenters.
Thank you, Ashley. Just a quick note on who you'll be hearing from today. We have Kathy Kirby, Research Information Specialist at OCCRL, and myself, Heather McCambley, Project Director for Pathways to Results, and Edmund Graham and Marcy Rocky, Graduate Research Assistants here at OCCRL. So just to set the stage quickly, and give some context for this facilitation tool that we've been working on. The Office of Community College Research and Leadership has been working for over 2 decades in the area of career pathways research. And I have a couple of examples on the screen now of the type of leadership and research we've been doing around career pathways design and implementation. We have our Pathways to Results project, which is an equity-focused model for career pathways improvement. The Transformative Change Initiative, working with national TAC grantees, looking at how to scale innovation in career pathways to transform more equitable student outcomes and to scale the resulting innovations. We have STEM college and career readiness, research and leadership here in the state of Illinois, as well as new research on STEM pathways in minority-serving community colleges. And just a quick note on pathways to, again, set the stage for this new tool and for this discussion today. The traditional approach to looking at pathways has a lot to do with looking at the transition from secondary to post-secondary career and technical education programs of study. Looking more broadly at this point, the characteristics of really strong CTE pathways are being applied in broad ways, and the characteristics like clear advising, coherent pathways, strong support services with multiple exit and entry points into the career pathway are being applied in a broader context in higher education to improve student success outcomes. So when we talk about career pathways at OCCRL at this point, we really look in both the more narrow traditional definition, looking at that post-secondary or secondary to post-secondary transition, as well as in the larger context of applying these principles to and through higher education and into the workforce, whatever that pathway looks like. So I just wanted to set that stage. Now, working in the field of student success and in the pathways space, we've produced a lot of evidence at OCCRL, as have other offices similar to ourselves, in terms of research, resources, and interventions related to different aspects of creating more successful pathways that lead to and through higher education and into the workforce. So our goal today is to share a beta framework, or a practical and specific facilitation tool to support team-based and evidence-based problem solving using some of the many resources that have come out of OCCRL over the years, as well as some of our trusted partner organizations. As we've worked with partnerships improving student pathways all across Illinois and well beyond in national projects, we've worked with them on how do you adopt an evidence-driven mindset, and that's a phrase that comes up a lot in current work in higher education. Data-driven decision-making, evidence-based decision-making. And we find that practitioners in the field working on these changes are juggling many types and sources of evidence and sources of data. In the last year, we've begun to see an existing asset we have at OCCRL, the Illinois Guiding Principles for Career Pathways, Implementation, and Improvement, as a foundation for the creation of a systemic way to facilitate discussion among teams and action among teams to move from an evidence-based problem, and we see on the left in this visual sources of data and evidence in a local context around student outcomes and processes and practices, how to bring that to bear on a problem-based statement, and then bringing in the larger context evidence from national organizations or larger research on student population needs and strengths or evidence-based intervention and practices. So using this existing framework that we have for principles for career pathways in order to organize this wealth of resource and sometimes overwhelming wealth of research that we have in order to transform student pathways. So that's sort of the foundation for what the purpose of this facilitation tool or framework that we will present today is all about. But with that, I want to take a moment to introduce the guiding principles for career pathways, and there's no one better to do that than Kathy Kirby. So turning it over.
Thank you, Heather. Putting together the original framework for the guiding principles, which you see listed 1 through 6 on this slide, was undertaken with the help of leaders and practitioners throughout Illinois when Perkins 4 was passed in 2006, 10 years ago already. Seems impossible. But as many of you probably remember, Perkins 4 had a very strong emphasis on creating or strengthening coherent programs of study, which wasn't a new concept, but it was the impetus for our developing this framework so that we could say we're not doing the same thing we've done under Perkins 3 and 2 beginning in 2006. We're talking about a broader concept, one that includes more auxiliary help, more than just coherent academic or career curriculum from secondary to post-secondary. You'll recall that at the same time, there was the national movement to adopt career clusters, and OCCRL led that effort in Illinois, and we adopted the career clusters framework in 2008 after a lot of discussion and input from practitioners across the state and with our secondary and post-secondary state agencies working together. So the original 6 principles that you see here on the slide were developed and based on research back in 2006, 7, 8 on various educational change models. We looked at the Workforce Investment Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, High Schools That Work, the American Diploma Project, the 21st Century Skills, Common Core, many educational initiatives that were talking about change and reform, and looked across what they had in common to help develop those 6 principles. So we used the principles once they were developed as a way to guide practice at the local level. Practitioners used them to develop proposals for their Perkins grants. They organized their action plans around the guiding principles. They were used as a focus for professional development in the state, and we also used them in developing the evaluation of implementation of post-secondary Perkins programs at Illinois' 48 community colleges, with OCCRL developing that evaluation plan. In 2015, the principles were reviewed, the principles back from 2009, to determine what needed to be added, dropped, or adjusted to reflect the broader concept of career pathways, which Illinois had adopted as part of our Shifting Gears initiative years before. We looked then at 8 specific career pathways initiatives across the country. Most of them were national, except with one exception being an Illinois-based Pathways program in adult education. But in each of these major pathways, we looked at their essential elements, their criteria, their features. We looked at their toolkits that were available on the websites, etc. And we crosswalked all that information with our original guiding principles and design elements to find areas that we had in common, areas that we were missing in Illinois, and at the same time found many areas that other pathway principles did not include that our Illinois models did include. We presented those findings to about 25 people in Illinois, practitioners and leaders, for their review and advice, which is the way we do business here. And they, interestingly enough, they agreed that these 6 principles, which were our original principles, still applied to career pathways, as well as they did programs of study that we had developed in 2009. That's not really a surprise, wasn't a surprise to us, because back in 2009, we really were thinking very broadly about programs of study, really much more closely to a career pathways model back at that time. So the changes in the 2015 version lie mainly in the design elements, and on the screen now is one example for the principle access, equity, and opportunity. Below that, you see a principle statement, which in this case is all students have access to educational opportunities at multiple entry points and receive support services that lead to equitable outcomes. Underneath that are 6 design elements, which have changed only slightly for this particular guiding principle from the original 2006 version, or 2009 version, excuse me. But we find that these design elements are very helpful in fleshing out what do we mean by access, equity, and opportunity, and how can we at a local level look at our formats, look at our barriers, our support services, our networks. Again, these are essential elements that you'll find in multiple career pathways principles, and we find that they've been working very well. I encourage you to look at the publication that's on the screen and the link to it. You can see all 6 principles as well as the design elements that support them, and we hope that you find them as helpful to your efforts as we have in Illinois. I now turn it over to Edmund Graham, who will talk about using these principles in a facilitation tool that are based on them, and he's divided them into foundational guiding principles and student-faced design guiding principles, which I think is a very concrete way to think about something that looks like a concept or a philosophy, but in fact is actually very practical. Edmund?
Okay, thank you, Kathy, for that historical context and developments regarding the guiding principles. As Kathy mentioned, I will be discussing how the guiding principles have informed and also have been included in our facilitation tool for transforming pathways, and providing a general example of how we envision the tool will be used in practice. So as of now, this graphic is a representation of how we think the guiding principles will actually function in practice, beginning with the foundational principles. In the context of creating a more equitable and culturally relevant environment for student success, the foundational principles provide the structure for responsive change and the mechanism for double loop learning within the institution. Additionally, these 2 principles provide the structure for the 4 student-facing principles. In order to change long-standing equity gaps, institutional practices and policies must address the specific needs and strengths of diverse student populations in innovative and reflective ways. For this reason, the 4 student-facing pathways principles can be used with what we know about the strengths and needs of specific student populations and evidence-based practices in order to identify and implement focused strategies for improving pathways. Starting with the principles, we create a facilitation tool by which a team using Pathways to Results, which is OCCRL's equity guided process for improving pathways, outcomes could use their data to work towards evidence-based solutions by leveraging the strengths of student populations and directly addressing the specific needs of those students at the same time. We believe that this is a tool for any partnership to move from evidence-based problem statements to effective evidence-based solutions in practice. From here, I'll provide a step-by-step example of how we envision the facilitation tool will be used in practice. To begin, it is necessary to create a problem statement that identifies a student population or populations and the inequities they experience, and also the outcomes that are affected. In this example, men of color are experiencing disparate outcomes and critical milestones and in completion compared to other student subgroups. Moving from the problem statement, it's important to review the guiding principles and determine where the defined problem is best described by the 6 principles and 1 or more associated design elements. In this particular example, the student outcomes and process data might lead to a decision that the issue facing men of color on their campuses is best described by the Access, Equity, and Opportunity Guiding Principle, and specifically the design element suggesting that pathways must feature comprehensive and proactive support services. Once the corresponding principle and design elements have been identified, it's important to document key strengths and needs specific to the student population that should be reflected in any proposed intervention. For example, in the context of completion, men of color may benefit in particular from building relationships that connect them socially and academically on campus in a manner inclusive of their racial and cultural identity. Moving from specific population strengths and needs, we encourage teams to select 1 or more potential interventions supported by evidence or to be piloted and evaluated for effectiveness. Moving on and documenting the strengths and needs within that population will be addressed by this intervention in its alignment with the identified outcomes gap in the pathway principle and design elements. In this particular example, given the parameters specific to men of color in the selected design element focusing on clear and proactive support, potential viable practices including an early alert system intended to connect men of color very early on to academic and cultural supports at the first sign of academic difficulty. Alternatively, or additionally, a first-year experience cohort designed specifically to provide support, mentoring, and social connections among men of color could also be used or a strong option to improve completion outcomes. Again, this is just a quick, short example of how we envision this tool will be used. Up next, we'll have Marcy Rocky, who will provide more information on resources that we have within our office related to student populations and also evidence-based practices.
Thank you, Edmund. As we look forward to the forthcoming brief, and if we think about Heather talking about the steps of addressing evidence, in this first list we have evidence from our insights on equity and outcomes, different briefs that talk about evidence for unique student populations. So we can think about understanding maybe the unique needs, the unique strengths, and then unique challenges that we have in different student populations. So as we're gathering evidence, these can be great resources as you're maybe looking at disaggregating your data and thinking about which groups of students you might want to consider or focus on. The second list that we have relates to evidence on practices. And again, we have some insights on equity and outcomes brief series, some resources related to the Transformative Change Initiative, and then other resources from other organizations that are well known and maybe helpful as we look at, again, evidence on practices that can meet student needs once we've identified a specific population that we're thinking about. And so as a part of looking at evidence-based practices, my colleague Randy Congleton and I recently released a brief through OCCRL related to Edmund's example of the power of the first-year experience in promoting student success, particularly from an equity standpoint. And so that brief was recently released, and again explores the role of first-year experience, and very specifically also looks at student success seminars and the role that they can play in enhancing student success. So again, evidence-based, we look at populations, we look at practices. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Ashley in case anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you all of the presenters for presenting this wonderful information and this new tool. It looks like we've had a couple of questions come in, and so I want to post those to our presenters. The first one being, are all of these publications found on your website?
Yes, absolutely. You can find all the publications we've referred to on the website. As a participant in this webinar, we will also be sending out a follow-up email immediately after the webinar. That email will include a link to a survey where we'll just try to get feedback on this draft tool that we shared today. Before we finalize and distribute it, we're hoping to get your feedback on, in what ways this would be useful and in what ways it could be changed to better fit your context, the context in which you're working with Pathways. As far as the other publications on populations and on practices, again, all of those links are live and will be in the finalized PowerPoint deck that will be sent to you in that email along with the survey. So you will have direct links to everything, in addition to being able to go to our website, OCCRL.illinois.edu, to access all of these resources. And then there's a second question about if there's a handout to download. So I think my last answer addressed that. But in addition, we will be sending a follow-up email in between 1 to 2 weeks with the finalized tool that we discussed today. Again, we're going to be taking your feedback via the survey before we finalize the tool. But then we will send that to you so you can also download the final version of this tool for your own use.
Okay, looks like I just want to remind the audience that if you do have questions for the presenters, feel free to please submit those at this time through the question tool on your webinar toolbar. But we have another question. Do you have specific curriculum resources for educating students in Pathways programs that have a wide range of skills that vary by student?
I'm thinking about the specific, it is a question that has come up. It actually just came up yesterday when we were on a site visit for our Pathways to Results project. Specifically, I don't know if this question has to do with math and math pathways, but that was where it came up in our site visit yesterday. So I'm looking at the individual who asked about this particular question. I want to look in our college and career readiness resources, and maybe Edmund can speak to this, but we will happily follow up directly to look at kind of in our research and our resources what we have around dealing with a wide range of student skills in a single kind of curricular context, and see what we can come up with to follow up with you. Edmund, is there anything that you would add?
I think it's a really good question.
Oh, okay. We're going to repeat the question. So, is there a specific resources around curriculum for educating students in Pathways programs when they have a wide range of skills that vary by student?
So I don't think we have anything in particular that specifically addresses the different skill sets of students with a particular pathway. But I mean, I think we do have examples of different ways that colleges around the state have attempted to address that. And as I said, that's something that we can share after the call. I'll reflect it in some of the reports with the STEM college and career readiness, and even the earlier iterations of college and career readiness.
Kathy, did you have anything to add? It looked like I might have cut you off.
No, I think that, well, perhaps the Pathways Resource Center might have some insight there. Their work is affiliated with OCCRL's work, and they have a website as well. I believe that part of their charge was to gather resources, and I can't specifically say that that type of resource is there, but it would be worth checking it out. I wish I could offer more.
All right, great. That is something it's worth following up on. And again, I'll look at how we can follow up with the individual who asked that question. Do we have any other questions? We have just a couple of minutes left. We're happy to take one or two more. All right, it looks like we have answered all of your questions for now. We want to thank you again for participating in this, in what we're calling the coffee break webinar style, where we try to condense a look at one of our new and upcoming resources in 30 minutes or less. So it looks like we achieved our goal today, and we hope that you would be willing to share your feedback with us via the survey link that you'll be receiving shortly. Whether or not you do provide that feedback, we'll be sending you a finalized version of this facilitation tool with the step-by-step instructions for you to kind of see in full, and maybe at that point provide your feedback at a later time. So thanks to all of our presenters. This was a great 30 minutes to spend with you, and have a great afternoon.